Hi there, Booktube. It's the very beginning of August, so time to do a bit of a wrap-up of what I read in July. I finished 11 books in July. 5 of those were Jane Austen July reads, and the other 6 were one new novel in English, 2 recent fiction translations into English, a couple of translated classics from the 20th century, and a mid-century classic written in English. So a nice range. I'm going to kind of do this video in 2 chunks, and if it gets too long, it might end up as 2 videos. So I'm going to start with the sort of Jane Austen July 5 things, and then the other 6, the rest. And let's see how we get on. So you know how I love Jane Austen July, and thank you to the lovely hosts Katie and Marissa and Claudia. I always do all the reading prompts, if not the watching prompts. And this year, I particularly appreciated that there was a Discord server for Jane Austen July, and the discussions on there were just delightful. Thank you, everybody who chatted on there and shared ideas with me and everybody else. Really appreciated that. I particularly appreciated that there was a rereaders corner for the group read Emma. I've read Emma a number of times, and the delight of having a rereaders corner sort of discussion thread was being able to talk freely about rereading the wonderful, wonderful novel that is Emma without worrying about spoiling it for first-time readers, because if ever there was a Jane Austen novel that you should read without knowing the full plot before you start, this is it. No one should read an introduction or find out too much about what happens in Emma before they read it for the first time. That's what I strongly believe. So and it was lovely to come back to it, as it always is with Austen, because she's Jane Austen. Now, Tilly and I made a kind of fairly casual chatty video about Emma that I'll link to below. We also made a video about the Jane Austen retelling that we both read, and that's a sort of a discussion video, and again I will link to that, and it's us talking about This Motherless Land by Nikki May. Relatively recent retelling, modern in a modern day setting of Mansfield Park. Now, she's a Nigerian author, and she's also spent a fair bit of time in England, so she was very well placed to write a book that is set partly in Lagos in Nigeria and partly in Somerset in the west of England, and she brings up some really interesting themes in this book, some of which reflect the themes in Mansfield Park, and others are fresh and distinct and interesting. But as you will discover if you watch the video, I always struggle a bit with retellings of Jane Austen books, even when it's a modern day one like this and it's kind of only sort of loosely inspired. I just find myself making unfavourable comparisons with the Austen original. But that's my problem, not the book's problem. And Tilly gives a much more sort of balanced response to This Motherless Land. So don't necessarily be put off the book by the fact that I didn't absolutely love it, because that's just my attitude problem. There you go. Now, I had more success with the rest of my Jane Austen reading, I'm glad to say. And This Motherless Land wasn't a failure. I just didn't absolutely love it. Every year now I read some more of Jane Austen's letters in Jane Austen July. Why? Because there is a prompt to read something else by Jane Austen other than her 6 major novels. And I've read everything. She's written the 6 major novels, Juvenilia, Lady Susan, her unfinished novels, her poems, her prayers, the lot. So, and some of them more than once. So it's a real delight now to take the chance to slowly read through some of her letters, which are snarky and funny and chatty and gossipy, and have talk about some of her reading, talk about plays she goes to, talk about family, talk about really enjoyable. And each year I will gradually work through more of them. Each Jane Austen July. There you go. Now, my Jane Austen contemporary read, that prompt, was a very interesting experience this year. Definitely a successful one, and because I read, or rather listened to, in fact, The English Quixote by Charlotte Lennox. Now, this was written or published in 1752. Get it right, goodness me, 200 years out. Which was before Jane Austen was born. But Lennox's lifetime and her writing career kind of overlap with Austen. And we know that Austen read The Female Quixote. We know because she talks about reading it in some of her letters, talks about enjoying it, talks about how entertaining it is. And you can see in some of the juveniles, some of Jane Austen's writings when she was young, some of it has a similar flavour, I would say, to The Female Quixote by Charlotte Lennox. And we know that she read it when she was young, and then because she talks about rereading it in her letters, as an adult. It was also a direct influence on and kind of key inspiration for some of the shape of Northanger Abbey, because Northanger Abbey, as you know, is about a young woman who is led astray by the fiction that she's read and taking that too literally. And in Northanger Abbey, that's Catherine Morland's read perhaps just a bit too much in the way of the Gothic novel, and thinks real life is like a Gothic novel. Lennox's book was inspired by Cervantes' book Don Quixote, and the heroine of The Female Quixote, Arabella, like Don Quixote, has read a lot of chivalric romances, stories about knights and princesses and that sort of thing. And Arabella, because she has led a very sheltered life, sort of shut away in a kind of mansion in the English countryside and never mixed much in society. She thinks that life is like those chivalric romances, and this gets into her into some real pickles in a very funny way, like Don Quixote. This is essentially a humorous book with some philosophical themes, I suppose. I found it really entertaining. The pacing was a bit off at times. At times it dragged a little or felt a little repetitive, and then it picked up, and then towards the end it suddenly finishes in a bit of a rush, if we're honest. But I found out the reason why it finishes in what felt like a bit of a rush from one of the other books that I read for Jane Austen July, one of my two non-fiction choices. And that was Jane Austen's Bookshelf by Rebecca Romney. And Romney happens to explain in that book how Charlotte Lennox, as an author, was writing to keep herself. She was writing, she needed the money from what she wrote to live. Even more so than Jane Austen wanted to earn money by writing, but she was had a not rich, but she had a comfortable existence at that time. But Lennox really needed the income from her work, and she originally planned The Female Quixote as a 3-volume novel. Novels typically came out in either 2 or 3 volumes. But because she was running low on funds, she realised that she needed to squeeze it into 2 volumes and get it published, because it was like a kind of a publishing cycle in the 18th century, and books came out most books came out at a certain time of year, and she had to rush to finish it to get it into 2 volumes so it could be published, and she'd get the income sort of sooner rather than later. That is just typical of the kind of great little gems of information that came again and again in Jane Austen's bookshelf as a book. Romney is a dealer in rare fiction, and Jane Austen's bookshelf is kind of a memoir about a period of in her sort of life as a book dealer and book collector, when she developed a particular fascination with the women authors who wrote sort of around the time of Jane Austen, so a bit before her and contemporary with her, and some carrying on after her, but having started contemporary with her. And she's looking at their lives, but she's also looking at their publishing history and how that tells us something about why Austen came to be sort of overwhelmingly the most famous woman author of her generation, and others didn't. And how that's sort of revealed in or explained to some extent by the history of when and how they were published and republished. It's quite a personal book. It's not a book of literary criticism. It's not a book about saying these were the books on Jane Austen's bookshelf and these are how they influenced her writing. That's not. If you go into it expecting that's what you're going to read, you will be disappointed. But if you go into it ready to enjoy a sort of a bookish memoir that's about book collecting, book dealing, book publishing, that's about the lives of 5 or 6 really interesting women writers of the late 18th and early 19th century, and what they wrote and why and how, you will have a great time reading this book. And I think at times she over eggs the pudding. Okay, I find it hard to believe that she kind of describes Frances Burney and Anne Radcliffe as sort of complete unknowns in a way that they're not. They're just not. And the books that she reads by the writers that she chooses, she sometimes, I think, she makes them out to be, just as good as Jane Austen. And again, in my opinion, they're not. But they are jolly good books, many of them, and the ones I've read, and I feel moved to read others that she writes about, or the authors that she writes about. So yeah, a rewarding book, and it really complemented the other non-fiction book that I read for Jane Austen July, which is What Jane Austen's Characters Read and Why, by Susan Allen Ford. Now, this is a book in a more academic style. It is literary criticism and analysis, unlike Jane Austen's bookshelf. So, if that's what you're looking for, this is the one to go to. And it is about the books that Jane Austen obviously read, because it's about the books that she refers to in her novels, the books that she gets her characters to read or to talk about or mention, and what that would have meant to Jane Austen's readers when they heard this character talk about reading this book or liking this book, or if Robert Martin in Emma reads Oliver Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield, what does that say about Mr. Martin? It's and how some of the books that are referenced, how they hint at things kind of happening beneath the surface of Austen's novels, what sometimes about sort of politics, sometimes about religion, about ideas of the time, that she was implying by mentioning certain authors, certain books. It's a very dense read, I would say. I learned lots from reading it. It really did give me fresh perspective at times on Austen's novels, and these are books that I know really well and have read a lot. It made me recognise how embedded in literature Austen herself was as a writer. Her reading really sort of informs her as a writer. And a quotation from one of Austen's letters that Susan Allen Ford, I haven't waved the book actually, that Susan Allen Ford comes back to again and again in this book is one that I love. And it's she wrote to Cassandra around the time that Pride and Prejudice was published. I do not write for such dull elves as have not a great deal of ingenuity themselves. And what she was saying is what Austen was saying was she expects her readers to come to her books with a degree of, I don't know, alertness, awareness, perhaps some prior reading. You know, she's you know, Austen would never dumb down what she wrote, to use contemporary language. That's what she's saying. And I like that, and I like this. It's a good book. So, what a satisfying Jane Austen July. Now, how are we doing for time? We're around 15 minutes, so I think I can safely carry on and talk about the rest of my July reading. But with timestamps, I'll make sure that you can kind of pick and choose what if you know which bits you want to hear about. So, I read only one newly published novel in English in July. That's unusual for me, isn't it? Luckily, it was a jolly good one. Hurrah for that, we say, because it was Endling by Reva, and I made a single book review video of it, which I'll link to below. Just after I finished reading it, like about 2 days later, it was on the chosen for the book along list, and I was delighted to see that. It's an unusually shaped novel, unusual structure. Why? Because Reva is a Ukrainian Canadian, and she was writing a novel that she was partway through at the point when the Russians invaded Ukraine, the recent invasion. And of course, that turned things on their head for her as a writer, as a writer of Ukrainian origin. She had to have a complete rethink. And how could you write a sort of darkly funny book about endangered snails in Ukraine and romance tours, the kind of like, tours that Americans and Europeans come on to try and find a nice Ukrainian bride, how could you write that once Ukraine has been invaded? You can't, can you? Or can you? Maybe you still can, but just give it a bit of a twist. If you want to know how she resolves that dilemma and writes an absolutely brilliant and very moving novel about Ukraine and the Russian invasion and more, watch the video and read the book, both of which I recommend. The other two kind of contemporary books that I read this month were both in translation. And the first of those was Standing Heavy by GauZ. So that was originally published in French in 2014, but the translation by Frank Wynne to English came out in 2022, and it was shortlisted for the 2023 International Booker. Again, there will be a standalone video about this. It's a live show that I'm recording with Katya. I'm recording it after I record this video, but it may appear before this video does, if you know what I mean. But one way or the other, there either is or will very shortly be a recording of a live show about Standing Heavy, because it was our Reading the Globe contemporary choice for July. And what a good choice it was, because it was an absolutely fascinating novel that almost doesn't feel like a novel. I absolutely loved it, but not everyone did, and not everyone will. Why? So GauZ, that's his pen name, is from the Côte d'Ivoire. Grew up there, lived in France for a little while, and then is back living in the Côte d'Ivoire. And this book kind of grew out of his experience of coming to Paris as a student with some sort of visa issues and working as a security guard to support himself while he was doing his masters in Paris. So, and that's the sort of the background for the book, because it is about the experience of migrants to Paris from Côte d'Ivoire and other sort of surrounding countries, working as security guards because that's one of the very few occupations open to them, especially if they're undocumented or their visa status is a bit wobbly. It's, as I say, it almost doesn't read like a novel. It jumps around. It's in different 3 different time periods. It has sections that are more like kind of observations by a security guard standing one in a clothes shop, one in a perfume and toiletry sort of store, and observing the people that come in from his perspective as a security guard. I found it short but delightful and revealing to me about a sort of aspect of life that I don't know. So I always like that in a book. Sadly, the other sort of relatively recent novel, even more recently translated into English, that I read was less of a success for me. Okay, it was Days at the Morisaki Bookshop by Satoshi Yagisawa, translated by Erika Ozawa. Lots of people love this book. I've seen a lot of kind of like positive reviews for it on BookTube, on Goodreads, on Storygraph, whatever. It's undoubtedly a very nice book, but sometimes for me, nice is not enough. It was, a gentle, thoughtful book can be lovely, but this was just a little lackluster for me. The good thing about it is that it's a book about bookshops and reading and how books can get you through heartache and help you kind of restore your sense of self and your kind of way forward in life, I suppose. I should love that, but it was just a bit, I don't know, unexciting for me. What it did do, though, was give me a bit of a list of sort of 19th and 20th century Japanese fiction that I would like to read, that was sort of mentioned through the course of the book. So I need to remember that about it, and not the fact that I found it a bit, ever so slightly dull. There you go, sweet but dull. Now, a slightly older translated book that I read, two that I read this month were both much more successful for me as reads. One I knew would be, because it was a reread, and that was a reread, or a listen in this case, to The Cherry Orchard by Anton Chekhov. Now, I listened to it, and slightly shockingly, the Audible book that I listened to didn't name the translator, so I can't name it for you either. It didn't name the cast, but yeah, and it was a good reading of what is a lovely play. It was Chekhov's last play to be published and produced. It's from, I think it's 1903 or 1904, around then. And it's kind of billed as a comedy, but it's actually a tragedy, or vice versa. It's a tragicomedy about the sort of the dying days of the Russian aristocracy, I suppose, and the cherry orchard, and having to sell the cherry orchard, and the likelihood that the cherry orchard is going to be cut down is the sort of the central symbol, I suppose, of the play. Wonderful play, really happy to revisit it, which I did because it was one of Angelia's chosen plays for Endless Drama, as a year-long read a play or two a month sort of group read, which I will do a link to below, because there's still several months to enjoy, and with lots of good plays to come. But even more exciting than The Cherry Orchard for me was reading this. So this was written about 50 years later, so 1957 I think was published in Arabic by the Egyptian author Naguib Mahfouz. It's Palace of Desire. It's the second in his Cairo trilogy. I buddy read it with Erin. It was just as much of a wonder of a novel as the first book in the trilogy, which is called Palace Walk. And if you haven't read it, read that, and then you'll want to read this. And as I say, it was written in the 1950s, but it's set in Cairo of the 1920s. As with The Cherry Orchard, it's set in what was a time of enormous social and political and economic and cultural change in Egypt. And that's key to the book, because we follow three main characters, three men from one family, a father and two of his sons, and how they are kind of dealing with this period of change in very different ways, and how that affects their relationship with each other and their relationship with women. It's a book about love, and it's a book about lust, and about men being driven by those two things. It's a book about patriarchy, I guess, and how patriarchy affects men as well as women in negative ways. I think Erin and I both said as we were reading this that we should have hated the three men that this book is about, and we very much see, because we very much see things through their eyes, although their treatment of women is appalling and we were, outraged. They're such three-dimensional characters, as Mahfouz creates them, that you can't hate them. And he's deliberately doing that to make us see how they see, but also see how that affects them too. Yeah. Brilliant novel. You can see why he won a Nobel Prize for Literature, Mahfouz. There you go. Not enough read, Mahfouz, I would say, as an author. Now, the final book that I read is not one who is sort of neglected or ignored, but of her novels, this is one of the least read, probably, because I read, with Jo Smith, wonderful buddy reader, Virginia Woolf's Between the Acts, which was her last book. It was actually published posthumously, so just after her death. It was published in 1941. Her husband, Leonard Woolf, made the decision to publish it because it was complete. It just wasn't fully revised. So she didn't feel it was perhaps perfectly ready for publication, but it was close enough for him to feel that it was fair to publish it and not letting her down. And as the name perhaps implies, it's linked to a play, to a drama, Between the Acts. It's set in 1939. It's set in a village in England. The villagers are putting on the village play, but we see it more through the eyes of a family who are in whose grounds the play is put on. And because it's 1939, World War II is looming, and some of the characters are very aware of that and others more oblivious, but we are very aware of it. It's the dark shadow over the play, I suppose. But also for us as readers, you cannot help but also feel the dark shadow of what was to come a year later for Woolf. So, this is set in 1939. She was writing it in 1940. And of course, she was about to move into her final acutely distressing depression that led to her taking her own life. And, your reading has to be coloured by that. But this is often a very funny book, as well as being dark. The characters are vivid, eccentric, superb. Her dialogue is like spot on, as it always is with her. It was, a joy to read. It's not my favourite of her novels, but it was any Woolf is going to be, hands down one of the best things you read in any month when you read it, regardless of what else you read. And that is undoubtedly true of this. So that was my July's reading. I hope yours was equally rewarding. I would love to hear in the comments if you read any of these things that I read or the lovely things that you read in July. And see you again soon for another video.